Hello, my name is Olorotimi Osha. I like to talk about history and American presidents as well. Today, I'm going to be talking about a woman who played a pivotal role um, in the reforms to mental health, and in fact, she eventually founded the Anti-Insane Asylum Society. She also, since I like talking about presidents, her work led to the eventual exoneration and protection of the rights and release of um, Abraham Lincoln's wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, who had been committed into an insane asylum after that was of course after the death of her husband, Abraham Lincoln. So today I'm going to be discussing uh, uh, a woman known by EPW Packard. That's Elizabeth Parsons Ware Packard. I'm just going to call her Elizabeth Packard as well. So, unfortunately, she's known for having been a sane woman who was wrongfully involuntary committed for 3 years by her husband into an insane asylum. Um, so she lived in Illinois. Back then in the 19th century, women did not have rights in America. That's a married woman. A married woman did not have rights. Her husband, once she was married, her husband had rights over her. It was called coverture, right? He had the rights over her property and everything. So more or less, they were like slaves in law, right? They were slaves to their husband. And back then, the level of a woman's obedience to her husband basically corresponded or was correlated with her sanity. And so Elizabeth Packard, she was born to a relatively wealthy family. Her father was a minister himself, and he'd used his money to educate her. So, back then in the 19th century, it wasn't common for women to be educated. She was born around 1816, and so she was sent to a female seminary for her education, where she was trained in French, the classics. Of course, the classics were a big deal. Our founding fathers were trained in the classics, right? So classics, those are the things that they enhance your reasoning skills, right? You take rhetorical studies. Our founding fathers, James Madison, they were very well trained in the classics. That's why they could reason the way they did. So her father gave her training in the classics, and in school, because she was sent to a female seminary, and she also got training in algebra, right? So she was very logical, right? So she was a very intelligent woman, but unfortunately, her intelligence sort of worked against her. Um, so Elizabeth Packard, her father pressured her to marry a certain man who was a Calvinist minister, right? A Calvinist minister, and I've been saying I'm going to do a discussion on um, the Reformation. So Calvinism was one strand of Christianity that arose as a result of the Reformation, right? The Reformation in the Ages, and it's after the founder John Calvin, who set up a theocratic government in Geneva in Switzerland. Now, Calvinism was a strain of religion that was dominant amongst the Puritans. That was a Calvinist thought. And so I should probably just quickly discuss Calvinism today. Just give you a quick synopsis of the doctrine of Calvinism, so we can understand the mindset of her husband, who committed Elizabeth Packard into an insane asylum for 3 years. Um, However, today I'm not discussing religion. I'm discussing um, a mental health issue, and I'm going to be discussing the case that came as a result of this. Uh, uh, the confinement of Elizabeth Packard. That's Packard versus Packard, and because this is April is incidentally is apparently um, it is not quite mental health Awareness Month. That's in May. Mental Health Awareness Month is in May. But April is Stress Awareness Month and Autism Month. So those have to do with mental health and anxiety and things like that, and removing stigma from mental health. Uh, this is also um, sort of coincidental. I mean, it's useful or critical right now because everybody's been discussing the mental health of President Donald Trump and asking to declare invoke the 25th Amendment against him for incapacity, right? For incapacity. So it's sort of pertinent to discuss mental health right now. And so I'm going to use Elizabeth Packard's experience as a frame of reference. So let me quickly discuss what Calvinism was. So Calvinism was the strain of thought underpinning the Puritans, right? The Puritans were Calvinists, right? They had a lot of Calvinism in their doctrine. Remember, the Puritans were the Pilgrims were Puritans, right? The ones who landed at Plymouth. So Elizabeth Packard was actually from Massachusetts. She was born in Ware, Massachusetts. Her family did move to Illinois, right? Um, of course, President Abraham Lincoln was a representative from Illinois. He lived there as well, practiced there. Now, and Calvinism, um, we see it's a weird strain of doctrine, right? They're Protestants, but Calvinism, you see that strain of thought. The doctrine is probably what permeates most of American Christianity, right? So Calvinists believe in the what's called eternal security, right? The eternal security of the elect. The elect are the saints, right? So Christians typically believe that some people are going to go to heaven, some people are going to go to hell, right? So there's that Manichaean conflict. But importantly, right, Christians believe that Jesus Christ died for the sins of everyone, and anybody who believes in Christ, then they are saved. Now, Calvinists believe that if you believe in Christ, right, all you have to do is you don't even need faith, right? Faith doesn't save you. That God had done something pre predestined people who were going to go to heaven or hell, right? So this is what Calvinism, Calvinism, uh, Calvinism posits that God had predestined people who were going to go to heaven or hell. The elect were predestined; they're going to go to heaven. It doesn't matter whatever they do in life, right? It doesn't matter if they're good or bad. If you take Calvinism to an extreme, even Adolf Hitler could find himself in heaven. Adolf Hitler, it doesn't matter, he killed all those millions of people. Calvinists would say that Adolf Hitler would not burn in hell. That if God has determined that he's going to go to heaven, it doesn't matter what he did, he's going to go to heaven. And Calvinists posit that they have support justification for their thinking in the Bible. So that's a funny thing that happened during the Reformation. Everybody found justification for their beliefs in the Bible. So they take a certain portion of the Bible and they conflate it, they blow it out of proportion. The Roman Catholics found justification for their doctrines in the Bible. Protestants, Martin Luther, various sectionalists, they found justification for their beliefs in the Bible. An example that sort of supports Calvinism is remember when Jesus Christ was crucified on the cross, and he had two robbers being crucified with him. One of they for murder. They were criminals. They were murderers. They'd done terrible things, right? And it turned out, one of them, asked for forgiveness, asked Christ, for forgiveness. And Christ said, well, today you're going to be with me in paradise, right? So that's an example of, justification for what Calvinists believe, that, it doesn't matter that that guy had never done anything good in his life, but he had been predestined to go to heaven, to be in heaven with Christ. So that's sort of what Calvinists believe. Eternal security. It doesn't matter what they do, so long as, they've been predestined to go to heaven. Some people have been predestined to go to heaven. So you see Many people wonder why there's certain people in America who call themselves Christians. They do horrible things. That's because they follow the Calvinist strain of thinking, right? They believe they don't have to do anything to justify, to validate them as Christians. So that's that. I'm not going to spend today on theology. Maybe I'm going to do a video sometime and discuss theology. But right now, I want to quickly discuss Elizabeth Packard and how her work reformed um, uh, mental health and rights protecting personal liberty regarding insane asylums. So why was she? So again, I've talked about how she was highly educated for a woman of those times, and so she was pressured by her father to marry this guy called Theophilus Packard, right? And he was a Calvinist minister. He had very rigid, dogmatic religious beliefs. So he had a church, he had his congregation. And so between the ages of 26 to 42, she gave birth to several children, for between 5 and 6, I think five, children for this guy. So between 26 and 42 years old, she was giving birth to children for him. And initially, their lives had been sort of uneventful. They moved to Illinois, but at some point, she started to express um, she refused to comply, right? She refused to comply with her husband's religious beliefs. So she started to critique her husband's dogmatic religious beliefs. And at some point, she wanted to leave her husband's congregation. Then her husband, decided that, okay, he was going to have her committed. And so he secretly he hired a physician, a medical doctor, to start monitoring her and to secretly interview her. She didn't know the guy was a physician, and they had a ploy to have her committed. So this guy, his name was Dr. Brown. He pretended to be a traveling sewing machine salesman. And so he started to elicit her, comments from her. And so she started to talk. She was saying all sorts of stuff, right? And she disclosed to him that she found her husband to be domineering, and she didn't agree with his religious beliefs. And of course, it was revealed that she supported the abolitionist John Brown, right? That was the white guy um, who was an abolitionist, and he was eventually executed, right? Was convicted and executed. So she supported him, which was terrible at that time for white people to do that. And she had very strong uh, uh, beliefs against slavery. She thought slavery was immoral, and she expressed these things. And these views were contrary to her husband's uh, dogmatic, rigid views. Again, he was a minister, was a pastor. Pastors were very powerful then, especially once she wanted to leave her husband's congregation. So eventually, in 1860, they had her committed into an insane asylum. So she was committed there for 3 years. Where various doctors interviewed her. She refused to agree that she was insane. She insisted that she was not insane. She refused to change her religious beliefs. The grounds for her husband committing her was that, religious heresy, right? Really, that she expressed religious heresy, right? You would think that the First Amendment protected her, right? The First Amendment gives you, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, right? But remember, there was something called coverture, right? Coverture, once a woman married back then, the 19th century America, once a woman married, she lost all her rights. So she was literally like a slave, right? In law, she was a slave to her husband. He took over her rights. Her beliefs, she couldn't express those, uh, the autonomy that the Bill of Rights, provide us. That's the First Amendment. So her independence, her legal status merged under her husband. That's coverture. So her husband uh, was now her protector, right? And her role was to obey her husband, right? That was the status of women back then in the 19th century America. And so, and in the state of Illinois, um, even though a law had been passed, I think it was in 1851, in the 1850s, that before somebody could be committed to declared insane, committed to an insane asylum, they had to have a public trial by jury. However, not women. Women were not. A married woman was not entitled to, right? Only men. Men were entitled to due process, to have that public, jury. But a woman did not. A married woman did not have those rights. So a man could declare his wife insane, could have her institutionalized without her consent, right? He can have her committed to an insane asylum without her consent and without a public trial by jury, right? He could just have her committed. If anybody remembers the movie Lincoln, even though Abraham Lincoln suffered from manic depression himself, that would be called insanity back then, but he had rights of due process, so they couldn't commit him. He was a lawyer, right? He was also a lawyer. But if anybody remembers, he used to threaten to have his wife, right? His wife committed, that he would threaten her that he would have her committed because that was the law. A man could commit his wife. Eventually, of course, she was committed, but due to, she breakdown, three of her sons had died. Her husband had been, brutally killed in front of her and all that. So, but eventually, the reforms led by Elizabeth Packard would change the laws, right? And the law on bill on of the protection of personal liberty that would, and women having rights to due process, and the way she gradually dismantled coverture, it would give Mary Todd the ability to fight for due process and eventually be released, and she cleared her name again, for her to be declared sane. But in any event, Elizabeth Packard was declared, she was declared insane, put in the insane asylum. She never agreed. She refused. She insisted that she wasn't insane, and she refused to change her religious views. While she wasn't in the insane asylum, they tried to get her to change her religious views, but she insisted she would not. Um, but while she was there for 3 years, she was busy, right? She was very busy. She started to document the abuses against the women in the insane asylums. And she started to write, and she observed that there were many women who were sane and had been wrongfully committed like her, simply because their husbands considered them difficult women, or they refused to be obedient, right? So she eventually, her children started to petition on her behalf that she should be released, right? And eventually, a doctor declared that, well, she was incurable, that they could not cure her, and so he discharged her after 3 years. But she was discharged to the custody of her husband, who imprisoned her in the house. He locked her up in a nursery, and he boarded up, right? He her windows, right? He covered up her windows, nailed, wood to cover up her windows, and basically imprisoned her. She couldn't come out in their home, right? So, but how somehow there were people, friends who were concerned for her, and she managed to slip a note to one of her friends, a woman called Sarah Haslett. And Sarah Haslett got this note to a judge, Judge Charles Starr, and he got interested. So fortunately, he ordered her husband to produce her. He issued a writ of habeas corpus. I've done a video a long time ago, if anybody can find that video, in which I discuss the writ of a habeas corpus. It's considered the most powerful instrument in the law in the American legal system. So if somebody accuses you of something, you have to produce the body. The writ of habeas corpus is saying produce the body in court to be examined, right? So it prevents arbitrary detentions, right? So writ of habeas corpus. So her husband was ordered to produce Elizabeth Packard to his chambers. He briefly examined her, and then he now created a new trial, a trial for insanity, to test her insanity by jury, right? He ordered a jury trial in 1864. It was a 5-day trial, and it was sensational. Now, so her husband brought witnesses and his family to testify that, she was insane. But what was her husband saying was the basis of her insanity? He said because, her family said she argued with her husband, and because she wanted to leave his religious congregation, and that's why they said, she was insane. However, she got some lawyers, right? Her friends got lawyers on her behalf, right? And these lawyers brought neighbors, right? Her neighbors and all her neighbors who knew her, who didn't go to her husband's church. People in her husband's church sided with her husband, right? Because she didn't agree with their religious beliefs, right? And she wanted to leave the church. But the neighbors who didn't go to her husband's church, um, they insisted that they had never observed any symptom of insanity in her, right? And there was a doctor who talked on her behalf. His name was Dr. Duncanson. He was actually a physician. He was a medical doctor, but he was also a theologian at the same time. He was a theologian, he was a medical doctor. And he admitted that he interviewed her, right? It was her lawyers who got the doctor. He examined her, interviewed her, and he said that he doesn't agree with all her religious beliefs, but he said that he does not call someone insane because they differ in opinion. He doesn't call them insane, and he said that he does not find her to be insane. In fact, he actually found her to be a sane woman. Right, in his conversation, he found her to be a sane woman, and he said he wished that many women in the nation were like her, right? That they had more women in the nation that were like Elizabeth Packard, because she was actually a very intelligent woman. But her intelligence in the 19th century, where married women were supposed to be the property of their husbands in America, it worked against her, and especially her husband was a domineering, insecure man, right? He was an insecure a pastor, and so he was 14 years older than her, and he was very rigid. One of the things that was revealed, the doctor who had secretly, who had impersonated, who had been under guise of being a traveling sewing machine salesman who had been sent by her husband to interview her, she disclosed that she didn't like her, she didn't like her husband, um, so that kind of all of that worked against her. So the doctor said, this Dr. Duncanson, who was testifying on her behalf and who was a theologian, he said no, that she's a very sane woman, and he wishes there were many more women in the nation like her. The jury deliberated. It didn't take 7 minutes, just 7 minutes. A woman who had been locked up in an insane asylum wrongfully by her husband for 3 years. It took 7 minutes for the jury to decide that Elizabeth Packard was sane. So she was ordered released by her husband, by the judge, and the judge ordered her husband that he could no longer confine her, that she was not to be confined. So they declared her that she was legally sane, right? After that, the fallout was that her husband left Illinois and moved back to Massachusetts, but the bad thing is, she was released and she was penniless, right? So her husband had taken her children with him, and because back then under coverture, the woman had no rights over the children. The husband had virtually all rights, right? Complete, absolute rights over the children. She didn't have property rights. He took all the property. The house they owned in Illinois, he rented it out, right? And so she was homeless. She was penniless. Took all her money. So, but her freedom now led to a new career for her. So she became a public figure and then became a writer. She became a prolific writer. She wrote about her experience and she started to seek reform. And she was such a prolific writer and speaker that, she was able to earn substantial income independently from this. And she now started working on changing the laws on an insane asylum. So she got a bill passed, a bill for the protection of personal liberty in Illinois. She got a bill passed for Married Women's Property Act, right? She got that passed. So all these things, she basically had about 34 bills passed, right, across various state legislatures, which dismantled coverture. And so women now moved from being slaves in law to being equal partners and companions of their husbands. So women now had equal property rights and equal rights to their children as a result of the bills she had passed. And so eventually, because she had money, she had her income, and this new bill had been established, her husband voluntarily now handed over their children to her. So they went to live with her in Chicago, in Illinois. So she became a prolific writer. She became very famous, and that's Elizabeth Packard. And she advocated for, the reforms and rights of people in insane asylum. And she helped establish the right of women who were to be declared insane, that women had to have a jury trial as well, a public trial by jury before they could be committed to an insane asylum, just like men already had, gave women due process. And that was what helped Mary Todd Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's wife. That was what helped her get released after she had been committed to an insane asylum. So it helped her get released. And she also now worked on, uh, um, you know, cleaning up her reputation, making both people know that she was sane and not an insane woman. So Elizabeth Packard was a remarkable woman. And as a result of her work, various activists and reformers came up much later in the 20th century. Of course, in the 20th century, there are many advocates who are against psychiatry, the use of psychiatry. Of course, things have improved a lot. In the 1980s, and 70s and 80s, there was a deinstitutionalization movement because people like Elizabeth Packard, they wrote of the atrocities that occurred in insane asylums. Today, the laws have changed significantly, right? Even the term insane, right? It's changed. I've done a video talking about how insanity is no longer a medical term, right? They could be diagnosed under psychiatry. There used to be a journal, American Journal on insanity. That's changed to American Journal on Psychiatry. I think this was in 1921. And now there have to be diagnosis of an actual medical condition. For instance, instead of just saying somebody's insane, they have to have a medical condition, whether it's schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. So things have changed significantly. There are many activist groups, reform groups, movements that want to have psychiatry abolished altogether because of forced drugging. They argue that psychiatry is a social construct, right? And it's unscientific, right? Because many of their practices are indeed unscientific. Some people, on the other hand, argue that there are some biological basis to some mental illness. Um, but opponents of psychiatry argue that it's just a fig leaf for big pharma, right? Pharmaceuticals to sell drugs, right? And normally people who get committed, it's because they are non-conforming, right? They're non-conforming. They might have contrarian views, and that's their freedom, right? And it violates human rights, right? A lot of what happens violates our liberties, right? Our rights of autonomy, our rights to make our decisions, especially what happens in many of these psychiatric institutions, like forced drugging, forced hospitalization. If people want to go freely, they can, but there are many things that happen, that violate human rights, the forced hospitalization, and the fact that it's weaponized, especially against minorities. In the 19th century, uh, insane asylums were used by white men against their wives, right, against women, because white men had due process, public trial, so they couldn't just commit them easily. But women were easily committed by their husbands without a public trial. They didn't have due process until Elizabeth Packard lobbying and advocacy for reforms. So, of course, in the 19th century, there was still slavery, so it wasn't an issue for black people, because black people were owned, they were chattels, they were chattel property, they were chattel, uh, you know, the slaves. There was chattel slavery that just made them the property of white people, right? And so the issue of their goal was just their role was just to obey. They couldn't question, right? But so insane asylums was actually a weapon against white women. It was used by white men against white women, right, in the early part of America in the 18th and 19th century. And of course, Elizabeth Packard was instrumental in changing that. Now, today, since there's no longer slavery, you see it's now weaponized against black people, both black men and black women. Uh, they use it in conjunction with the criminal. It's been merged with the criminal justice system, and it's been in a state like Maryland. Mental mental institutions have been weaponized against uh, black people, right? Especially through the courts, and so it's been used to deny black people their civil rights, their human rights, and their due process of law. It's been used to deny them, their Sixth Amendment rights to a speedy trial, to a public trial, and a judge can just declare. Judges commit fraud, right? I've talked about the instance of Judge James Bonifant of Montgomery County, Maryland. But in any event, I'm going to stop this video here. I'll continue with other discussions and talk about other cases that deal with mental health. Um, so Packard versus Packard, it declared Elizabeth Packard as sane, that she was not insane, and it freed her from confinement by her husband. My name is Olurotimi Osha, and I will keep you posted. Thank you.